Okay, we finally made it. Here we are, the last video for Unit 5 about agriculture and rural land use. And we're going to be talking in this last segment about plantation farming, the specialty types of crops, Mediterranean agriculture, luxury items, very, very commercial and very, very dependent on latitude and climate. So when we think about plantations, a lot of American students are going to immediately say, oh, plantations, you mean like in the southern states with slave labor before the Civil War. Today's plantations are similar in the sense that they are dependent on low wage labor, not slave labor, but low wage labor for sure. And they are generally smaller than maybe what the plantations would have been in the antebellum South before the war. Generally, you'd see coffee and cocoa type plantations, maybe 30 hectares. Um, and so when you think about a hectare being 3 acres, 30-acre farm is maybe 10 hectares. That's about an average kind of a plantation farm. So a lot of this, remember, is commercial. It's not subsistence. These are products that the indigenous people are going to be growing for export. They are dependent on the pricing that's set in the global marketplace. It's usually a buyer's market. It's not a seller's market or an exporter's market. Remember, we watched the coffee go round in class. And for those of you who were here that day, you know that sometimes the farmers make very, very little money off of the exportation of these crops. So a lot of the money is made by the companies that control it. Big, gigantic multinational corporations like Dole in the fruit business, Nestle, one of the biggest chocolate companies in the world, Kraft, which is not just mac and cheese. You'd be amazed how many items you can pick up in a supermarket, and you're going to find that Kraft Foods is on the back of it. And then, of course, even Nabisco, which used to be the National Biscuit Company, and it got shortened into its acronym there. But these big, gigantic food companies are really at the forefront of these large commercial economies that are in the developing world, the less developed countries. West Africa, when you think about cocoa or cacao, Madagascar with vanilla, coffee, East Africa, Indonesia, the Latin American countries, Central America, Colombia, Brazil, in South America. A lot of these are these plantation economies. So when I mentioned that latitude is a big factor here, when we think about Mediterranean agriculture, you come from the Mediterranean across and you get to California. When you come from East Africa, you come across and you get Colombia. So, this would be like coffee in the highlands, highlands of Indonesia. Sumatran coffee is some of the highest quality coffee lately in the world. Tea plantations across Southeast Asia, Malaysia, India, Sri Lanka, big tea plantations. So when you think about climate, and always remember that your latitude lines are going to connect areas of equal climate, and therefore that this agriculture is very dependent on climatology. So you look at, for example, climographs. This is the one for Miami, Florida, and it talks about the amount of precipitation. You can clearly see that we have a wet season and a dry season and moderate temperatures throughout the year. As you guys know, sometimes it's like winter here in South Florida. It's not like a season, it's a weekend. We had temperatures in the 40s earlier this week. That might be it for us this winter time. So when you think about climographs, they can give you an overview of what the climate will be like in a place long term. Remember, weather is short term, climate is long term. So one of the big plantation crops historically, of course, was cotton. And the southern states, they kind of felt like their cotton was indispensable for the British Empire. They assumed that the British would intervene, would become involved in the diplomatic side of things. They certainly reached out to the UK for recognition. They kind of felt like what they were doing was exactly what the founding fathers had done in terms of rebelling against a government that they felt like was not being responsive to their situation. And of course, it's this war about slavery. They wanted to keep the slaves. What the Southerners were disappointed by was they figured out that the British didn't need Southern cotton nearly as much as maybe what they thought they did at the beginning of the war, because Great Britain, with their huge overseas empire, found out that they could grow cotton in places like Egypt, India, Pakistan, which all of these areas were under British control. And so therefore, the Industrial Revolution and its, appetite for cotton and everything in the textile industries, everything made out of those cloths of the day, the British found out that they could get their cotton from elsewhere. Today, cotton is still grown. Again, a lot of cotton production, even still today, is in South Asia. There is still some cotton being grown in the southern states. There was a big boll weevil problem, a pest that got into the cotton in the early 1920s and 30s in the United States. But of course, now we have pesticides and chemicals. Cotton today is one of the most heavily sprayed crops in the world. That's why there is now organic cotton, which has not been grown with the application of pesticides. But also today, cotton is, competing against the man-made fibers. Your yoga pants are not made out of cotton. They're all these stretchy materials, the nylons, the polyesters, and they're more durable. And cotton today has kind of suffered in that sense. But even still, things like T-shirts and blue jeans and all kinds of things. This cool little graphic tells you a little bit about, where does your T-shirt come from? Where is the cotton sourced? How is it shipped to the factory? Who's doing the work in the factory? Is it a sweatshop? Is it child labor? We'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the industry chapter, which is Unit 7. And sometimes people will say, well, I'm not going to buy that T-shirt because it was made by sweatshop labor. And all of that sounds very noble and very, very morally right. But sometimes you have to consider, what's the next worst issue for those people? If you don't buy that cotton T-shirt because it was made under bad working conditions, okay, what happens? You didn't buy the shirt, the factory shuts down. Now all those people have no job, right? Maybe they had a bad job, but it was better than no job at all. And so when you think about some of these moral issues, it's a complicated onion of different layers of these social issues that go on. What do you do with your cotton T-shirt when you're done with it? Do you donate it? Do you send it off to the landfill? There's so much about the clothing industry that needs to be considered when you talk about the environmental impacts, the ecological effects, but also the economic and the social and the political issues. Rubber is another product that most American kids probably don't think a lot about, but it's used, of course, in the automotive industry. Your car only touches the ground in 4 places. Guess what? Those 4 places are made out of rubber. Rubber is also used in the aviation industry. It is a sound dampener. It is when you think about electrical current, rubber is not a conductor. It's an insulator. It's an inhibitor of electrical current. So in the medical field, rubber gloves, all kinds of things, latex. So when you think about rubber today, a lot of it is man-made, but if it is natural rubber, it comes from a tree. And I've got some pictures here that are going to show you in Southeast Asia where they have these rubber tree plantations. This one happens to be in Malaysia. And what they do is they cut into the tree. It's almost like a maple syrup kind of thing, if you've ever seen that. But they cut these grooves into the tree, and the rubber will come out of the tree and drip into the little pans. And that liquid is then taken to a processing facility. The process for making rubber into its useful product is you have to take that liquid and you basically bake it. You're going to cook it. And the man who developed that process, his name was Charles Goodyear. You might know that name, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. But this is that idea of vulcanization, where they would bake the rubber and cook it to that consistency where it's pliable but also durable. Right? And again, the rubber soles of your shoes, there's just so many applications of rubber in today's global economy. And most of it is sourced from Southeast Asia, some of it in South America as well. So then we think about other luxury crops. And again, coffee is one that in the United States is just huge. We're 4% of the global population, and yet we drink 50% of the world's coffee. The United States used to be a big tea drinking society. Geopolitically, that kind of changed when a bunch of people dressed up as Native Americans and threw the tea in the harbor in Boston. Tea, though, is now making a comeback. Tea is now kind of sexier than coffee. Coffee is kind of regular, and tea is maybe more exotic. People with their chai teas and things like that. Starbucks bought out Teavana because tea was becoming such a big deal. Of course, we think of chocolate, and if you've ever been to Hershey Park in Pennsylvania, what a great tour they do, where they take you in and they show you how the chocolate is made. And it comes from that raw cacao. It's a bean that grows in a pod on trees, mostly in West Africa, but there's a lot of cacao in South America as well. And they will cut these big pods, split them open, scoop out the beans. And if you've ever tried real cacao or like cocoa powder, it is like dirt. It's bitter. It's not good. It's not sweet. It doesn't taste anything like a Hershey's bar. They have to mix it with sugar, with milk, with all kinds of other ingredients to make it that delicious chocolate that we all crave right around Valentine's Day. And by the way, Americans will spend close to $15 billion, that's billion with a B, around Valentine's Day. In addition, we think about vanilla, which, by the way, Madagascar is the world's biggest exporter of vanilla. But again, that's got some problems with supply and demand and with their supply chain lately. All of these farms are basically, like I said, plantations of about 10 hectares, which is about 30 acres. Remember, 3 acres per hectare. Coffee is a huge export. We tend to think that Colombia has this best quality coffee. The Colombians certainly will tell us that. But Ethiopia is the cradle of coffee. And really, if you go to some of the better coffee shops and you start to specialize and say, I just want my Ethiopian coffee from the highlands, or I just want Sumatran coffee, or I just want Guatemalan coffee, again, from the highlands, you can get some really amazing single origin coffees. But most coffee shops today, they don't do that because that kind of coffee would be very expensive. Instead, what you get is you get kind of a blend of good and bad coffee. Vietnam, surprisingly, for many people, is the second biggest coffee producing country in the world, but it's not the best quality. Brazil is the biggest producer by volume. And again, not necessarily the best quality, but today's coffee shops in America, they know that you're going to load that coffee up with, French vanilla or pumpkin spice or some sort of caramel latte, and you're going to put a lot of sugar and cream and everything. So the coffee doesn't have to be the best quality because you're not necessarily going to taste it. So when you think about these coffee plantations, these are big businesses. But again, a lot of the money is the companies that are the roasters, the companies that are the retailers, the companies, like Folgers is a big, gigantic roaster. Nescafe, which is owned by Nestle. Think about nowadays Americans getting so much of their coffee from their Keurig or from their Nespresso. The whole coffee industry has just been kind of disrupted and turned on its head within the last 10 years or so. And again, tea is very popular in Asia, always has been. The British, of course, have their culture around tea. But nowadays in China, coffee's becoming popular because, again, coffee's different. So if you're a Chinese person looking to be conspicuous with your wealth, maybe coffee is your drink of choice instead of tea. A lot of this work, of course, is being done by women. Remember that there's an inequity in terms of pay for women, and the roles of women in agriculture are changing all over the world as men have moved into urban areas looking for jobs and trying to send remittance money back home. This tea plantation happens to be in Malaysia. I went to a tea plantation when I was in Malaysia a couple of years ago in a place called the Cameron Highlands. If you want to go out on Google Earth and search that up, the entire area of the northern part of Malaysia that's on the Malay Peninsula is tea plantations. Very, very popular. And a lot of female labor in those tea fields. As I mentioned, this is cacao. This is the raw form of chocolate. This is West Africa. Countries like Cote d'Ivoire are big exporters of the coffee bean, or of the chocolate beans, the cacao beans. And again, it's in a pod that they'll crack open with their machete. And again, very labor intensive, maybe a farm of just a few acres or so, but they can generate a tremendous output of cacao, the raw form of chocolate. Then we're shifting gears. This is in East Africa. This is in Ethiopia. And this is coffee beans where the women are picking through and sorting through and discarding the coffee beans that are broken or that are not quite up to standard, and then they'll sift through, and only the coffee beans that meet the quality, levels will be admitted and then shipped and packaged. Most coffee is going to be shipped like this. It's going to be green still. And then it gets to the developed countries like Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, and then it's going to be roasted and ground up, and then that's what you kind of go buy in your supermarket when you buy, coffee in the bag form. It's usually already roasted, already ground. Some people, of course, in their home maybe do have their own roasters where they can make the freshest coffee. Remember latitude, we talked about that. Here are your biggest producers of coffee in the world. This is a little bit out of date. Remember, I just told you that Vietnam has now become the second biggest producer. So they knocked Colombia down to 3 and Indonesia down to 4. Brazil, though, by far still the biggest producer. Notice that this is all tropical equatorial and mostly in a highland type of a climate. Coffee does really well in mountainous areas. So again, the United States is not really producing it, but we're certainly consuming it, right? And then this is kind of showing you the economic breakdown of coffee, who's getting the money. Again, the farmers make very, very little of the actual cost of the cup of coffee that typically you tip the barista more than the farmer is going to get. And then we talk about fair trade options. You can pay more as a consumer, and the fair trade is a program which will pay the producer, the actual farmer, and their co-ops. They'll pay them a better wage, a better share of the money. And then the idea is that those communities can build schools and can build health clinics and those kinds of things. But again, as a consumer, you'd have to be willing to pay more. And it's not just coffee. You could do this with chocolate. You could do this with other kinds of crops. Fair trade certified is actually broadening out into all kinds of different food groups. Mediterranean farming, this is mostly grapes, olives, dates, almonds, those kinds of things. Historically, this comes from the Mediterranean basin, which is not just on the north side, Italy, France, and Spain, but also the south side of the Mediterranean, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, in the Middle East. All of these are areas where a lot of these Mediterranean type crops can be grown. Remember that grape production and wine production is correlated heavily to Christianity, the body and the blood of Christ for the Christians, and especially in the Catholic Church with their Mass. Olives today are really wildly popular, and olive oil, especially the best quality olive oils. A lot of people tend to think Italy, but Andalusia, Spain, really major big producer of high quality olive oils. Like many agricultural products, the appellation, where is it from? Grapes that are from Napa or Sonoma in California, you're going to pay more for that than you're going to pay for grapes that are, say, from, New York State or Virginia. Believe it or not, they grow grapes there too. Even Texas is now producing grapes for wine. Outside of California in the United States, Oregon and Washington have suddenly become more popular as well. But don't forget, if you go south of the equator, you'll get the same thing. Argentina, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, right? Very important that you see Mediterranean farming. Here's a good, cool map of wine production, and I just mentioned the U.S., also European countries, Argentina, South Africa, Australia. Notice China's a big wine producer, and this is kind of funny. You ask people, what fruit do they use? And kids will say things like plums or pomegranates or other fruits. No, it's still grapes, right? They still use grapes too. The Chinese have discovered wine in a big way, and if you go to California when you're 21 and you go tour some of these wineries, you'll find out that there's a lot of Chinese people there as tourists, and they're very interested in wine, and they've got a lot of money to spend, and they're coming over to the United States and bringing that wine back to China. Notice in the Middle East, again, generally an absence of alcohol. Again, think about your Islamic limitations in the Quran. You're not supposed to drink, not supposed to smoke, not supposed to eat pork. We've talked about that several times in these particular units, that religion can influence the culture, and especially when it comes to food and drink. These are some of the examples what I was telling you about in Napa County. A lot of migrant farm labor. Some of these people are the children and the grandchildren of Latino migrants who moved into the United States in the 1960s when the California wine industry was just exploding. Today, California is right up there with Europe in terms of quality. But again, volume is just tremendous. Now, this is crazy when I throw this number at you. Napa, generally regarded as the best quality of the wine in the United States, it's less than 5% of California's total output by volume. But yet, that's all you ever really hear about is Napa, 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 Napa. Finally, we need to talk about illegal drugs. And notice these are illegal drugs, although these laws are starting to change. For example, marijuana. California, Colorado, a lot of states in the country are starting to change and legalizing not just medical marijuana, but recreational use, and even products like hemp, which is being used a lot nowadays in clothing and things like that. So some of these laws are changing, but it's difficult to map drug production because it's not like the illegal drug people are going to say, hey, government, here we are over here. We have so many acres of, cocaine or whatever. The coca plant, it is a leafy plant in South America. They sometimes will chew it for altitude sickness. Everybody thinks Colombia, but it's not just Colombia. It's Peru, it's Bolivia, other countries as well. As opposed to heroin, which is an Eastern Hemisphere issue. Opium, for example, comes from Afghanistan, Pakistan, basically Central Asian countries. And again, drugs are always part of the informal economy. This is the under-the-table economy, the economy where it's not taxed, not regulated, unless, of course, like in Colorado, California, the new laws have been passed where it is able to be controlled by government at a different level. Remember, Mexico is usually a pipeline for drug trafficking from South America and Central America up through Mexico and into the United States. So remember, when we talk about issues like border walls, it's not just an immigration issue. There's also the issue of the conduit for illegal type activities that come in. Sorry about the time. I really wanted to get this one last video out. It's a little over 21 minutes or so. I think you'll be able to manage. Don't forget, we have an MCQ progress check coming up, and you got your test coming up next week. So let's be ready to go.